And so today he pulls out this passage of pray without ceasing or pray unending. And the idea is that we live in a state of prayer. Sorry, I saw all of a sudden eyes go shooting up high. We live in this state of being aware. To pray without ceasing is to open ourselves to what God's already doing all around us. And when we do that, suddenly it becomes vivid, and we see it everywhere. And so as we start today, we're going to start with a spirit of silence. And what I want you to do in this time is to say one of the most simplistic prayers that will change your life. Lord, speak, for your servant is listening. Lord, speak, for your servant is listening. Say it with me. Lord, speak, for your servant is listening. And throughout this day, as it comes back into your head, say, Lord, speak, for your servant is listening. This is how you tap into this idea that we're praying all the time. And so in these moments of silence, allow that to keep going through your mind as you focus yourself on what God has to say to us today. Shall I be in silence? Lord, speak, for your servants are listening. Lord, speak, so that we may hear the whispers of your voice. Lord, speak, so that we can see you everywhere and in everything. And so be among us now. For it's in Christ's name that we pray. Amen. How many of you have ever written a resume? Resumes are an interesting thing, aren't they? Because we are trying to share who we are, or at least what we've done, with another. But interestingly enough, as one who's looked through lots of resumes, is I often have a question, is it true? Anyone else ever do that? Because you never hear anything bad about themselves. It's always the best of the best, right? But so many years ago, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey decided they were going to test to see how honest people would be. And so they ran an ad asking for electricians with expertise at using a Sontag connector to apply for the job. They got 170 resumes for something that was completely made up in their own minds. 170 people that fibbed about what their experience was. I ran across a study this week that said it this way. The percentage of resumes that are misleading is 78%. 3 out of 4. Now, when asked the question, have you ever lied on your resume, 73.5% said no, never. Interesting, isn't it? You see, resumes are these things that aren't in and of themselves a bad thing or really a good thing. They're a picture into someone else and what they've been doing. But they aren't that person. That the resume is maybe what they've been able to do, but it doesn't define who they are. It doesn't define their character or their integrity or their passions or their hopes or their dreams. It's a look back. But oftentimes I have discovered people that think that their resume is themselves. And so they either get wrapped up in who they've been or who they think they are. And sometimes they live as though they're bigger than life. And the question becomes, what role does a resume play in our lives? And more importantly, what is the role that we're to play in this world as we grow in the spiritual life? So this reading that the young girl read earlier is out of Philippians. And to put it in context, Paul is writing to this church that he adores. And many people call the Philippian letter the joyous letter, because in this letter it talks about how happy he is with these people. But there's something going amok in the midst of their church. There's a group that is causing problems in the church that are promoting that they are more knowledgeable or should be the ones that the Philippians follow after. What we can tell from what Paul's writing about is that these are individuals that did not grow up as Jewish little boys and girls, but grew up in the secular world of that time and had come to faith and were circumcised as adults, the men, which every man wants to go through twice in life, right? And so what they're doing is talking about and trying to discredit Paul. And then Paul gives us his resume, his bio. If you think those guys have something to talk about, let me tell you a little about me and why I am the cream of the crop, the A triple star person, the one who you're going to hire in a heartbeat because it's a slam dunk. And he lists a few things that gives us insight into who he was. So he says this, I was circumcised on the 8th day. What does that mean? He grew up in a religiously focused family because the Old Testament law said that on the 8th day, every male child had to be circumcised. And so he's saying, I didn't get circumcised as an adult. I was born into this. But not only that, I'm not just born a Jew. I'm born of one of the 12 tribes, the Benjamites. And the Benjamites are known most often because of Jeremiah the prophet, who was a Benjamite. And so not only am I just a Jew, I'm also a Jew of Jews of the Benjamite tribe. And then he says, I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews. What does that mean? In essence, what it means is that in my house, we spoke the native language of our people. I didn't learn it. I grew up hearing it. And so that's why I'm even more qualified than these folks that had to learn Hebrew later in life. And then he goes on beyond that. In terms of how I lived out my faith, I was what? A Pharisee. And a Pharisee wasn't a religious order. It was a group of people that studied the law all their life, all the written law and all the verbal laws, and wanted to make sure that everyone followed the law. And so he was one who was of the cream of the crop of understanding the full law of Moses and the ancestors that interpreted those laws. And you would think that would be enough, right? But no, he keeps going. In terms of my devotion, I was a persecutor of the church. Like, I didn't just know the law. I was making sure that those Christian annoying people, they were going to die because they were wrong. And then he doesn't even stop there. In terms of living the law, I was blameless. No blemish on me. I was perfect. And what does he do with that? Nanny, nanny, boo-boo, I am way better than the dogs. And that's what the term that he uses to describe these people. Dogs. And remember, we like dogs, right? How many of you have a pet? Dog? Yeah? Well, in the ancient world, dogs were filthy, rotten animals. To call someone a dog would be the most insulting thing you could say to another person. And he says, those dogs don't have anything on me. Look at my resume. But I count all that as loss, as waste, as nothingness, in comparison to knowing the greatness of our God in Jesus Christ. What he's doing is messing with this group, saying, I have all the credentials, and it doesn't matter. You see, I climbed the ladder of success to find out what was the phrase from last week? It's leaning against the wrong wall, as Thomas Merton said. And Paul reached the pinnacle of what he believed he should be and found out he was leaning against the wrong wall. And so Paul goes into this explanation that for him to know Christ and Christ crucified and the power of the resurrection is more important than his pedigree, his resume, or anything that he's ever done on earth. So why is that important to us as we look at Richard Rohr today? Well, Richard Rohr is a father. I'd call him a father monk because he kind of fits both worlds, who lives in Albuquerque, New Mexico today. And he's written a lot of books, and many of you get his daily devotionals through email. Anyone? Yeah, a few of us. Really good, interesting, powerful stuff that invite us into a deeper way of living. One of the great books that he wrote is called The Naked Now, Learning to See as the Mystic See. I would suggest that if you want to read further, this is one of the great books on mysticism and what it means to see fully. The other book that we're going to look more into today is this book called Falling Upward, Spirituality for the Two Halves of Life. And this book, for me, was soul-shaping. Really changed my life and my journey. That I had realized I was leaning against the wrong wall in my own personal life. In this book, we're going to explore, because in essence what he's doing in this book is inviting us to look at ourselves fully. And the way he does it is he separates our life into two halves. You have the first half of life, and then you have a second half of life. In the first half of life, the goal is to become ourself, to have an awareness of who we are and what we're gifted with and talented with. In the first half of life, it's not bad. We all go through it. It's a time in which our ego becomes really important. What ends up happening is that when we live only first half of life, it's always about me. It's always about promoting myself and other people saying great things about me. The first half of life is this constant absorbing what others are saying in order to find worth and meaning. First half of life living isn't designated by a certain age span. The reality of maturing is that, did you have a choice about physically maturing? No. How many guys, I don't know what it's like to mature as a woman, but I know what a guy's like. How many of you remember your voice cracking? And so you became scared to speak. Did no one else remember that? I remember being in the locker room comparing who had more armpit hair. You have one, I have two. Woo, I'm winning. Apparently, I am the only weird guy in the room. No one else did that? Obviously, I had no social filters. And so first half of living, physically, we naturally mature. We have no choice. We can't stop it. It happens on its own. Emotionally, we also mature, right? As we go older, we start maturing a lot of times because we get tired of running into walls. And we start learning wisdom because we're tired of making the same mistake over and over and over again. And we start to mature and learn how to communicate with others and experience life in its fullness. But the third part is that we have to mature spiritually. And spiritual maturity has nothing to do with age. Everybody hear that? Spiritual maturity has nothing to do with age. Spiritual maturity is the second half living, in which we dwell in something deeper and more profound, in which we learn that dying to self actually makes sense, and rising in the power of resurrection is the experience of our lives. Second half living is where we learn that it's not all about me. And instead, it's about something greater. It's about union with God and with others. And so Richard Rohr, one of the terms that he makes commonplace in this language is the term dualism. Dualism. Dualism is this idea of two ways, right? And the way that we live in our society is that there has to be right and wrong, good, bad, black, white, good, evil, right? We separate everything by categories, that we know that those kinds of people are good and those kinds of people are bad. And so what you hear a lot, and I certainly do, maybe I'm the only one listening to this, is that all Muslims are bad. All Christians are good. And what I discovered is that all the Muslims I've met, I would consider none of them bad. The extremism of what we see, I think everyone would agree is bad, including most Muslims. Just like the Christian extremism of people that think God told them to go blow up abortion clinics. Or people that say, in the name of God, we should go conquer other people. That's no better than the other extreme. And what has happened in our society, in our culture, and in our churches is that we learn, because it's easier, the rules. Good, bad. But what do you do with all the gray space in between? Because none of us are all good, and none of us are all bad. None of us are all good, and none of us are all bad. Another way that the mystics talk about it is that do we know ourselves, our full self, the shadow self, and the real self? And can we stand in the mirror and actually see ourselves as God would see us? And so in this book, he invites us to start thinking deeper. And in this process of thinking deeper, we start asking questions in new ways. So one of the questions that he says, or statements he says, is when you get your who am I question right, all of your what should I do questions tend to take care of themselves. When you understand who God's made you to be, everything else makes sense. That we don't have to inflate ourselves or our egos because we're okay with exactly how God made us. That we can live into the fullness of that. I learned many years ago that I wasn't perfect. It was called marriage. I remember, I think it was the first week, I left the toilet seat up because I grew up with a brother, right? We had our own bathroom. Why do you put the toilet seat down? And in the middle of the night, I found out why you put the toilet seat down when you're married. And I got a lot of trouble for that because my wife wasn't real happy. And in that moment, I realized for the first time in my life, maybe I'm not perfect. Just kidding. It was long before then. But the reality is that none of us are perfect. And none of us ever will be perfect. And so we're always this work in progress. And understanding the depth of who we are helps us to live into the union with God and with others. Another way of saying it as he does is that you and I are invited to look new at ourselves and to allow a new reality to emerge, to come up from the bottom out of us, in which we find ourselves in a part of a larger story that's beyond us, that we are tapping into. I like to think of it as a waterfall of grace that's always flowing, that we finally realize that's why we keep getting wet. And that we are not just holding the waterfall for ourselves, but instead it's big enough for everyone to enjoy. There's not a black and white, those are welcome to the waterfall and those aren't. Instead, the waterfall of grace that God sends to us rains on the good and the bad, of the knowing and the unknown, of everyone. So he says, when we enter from first half living into second half living, we go through a metamorphosis, a dying to a sense of who we have been, in order that we can be raised into who we ought to be. My favorite phrase out of the whole book, I think, is this: before the truth sets you free, it tends to make you miserable. Before the truth sets you free, it tends to make you miserable. Now, this is a statement that my mom called me, believe it or not, and said, I don't understand this. What does this mean? And so we sat on the phone for like a half hour, me trying to explain one line to her. And what it means is that as we enter into the second phase of life, the coping mechanisms, the things that we have structured our lives around, the things that have given us a sense of worth, don't work anymore. And it makes us miserable. But in that misery, we become open to new things. And in opening ourselves to new things, we start to become the new creation that Paul talks about in his letter. Elsewhere, as we talk about change, I've worked in churches long enough to know that the dirtiest word that you could ever use in church is change. You can use any four-letter word and people will be upset about it, but you say change and holy smokes, you would think that Jesus is coming back with fire and brimstone, right? And why is that? Why are we so afraid of change? Do you like change in your own personal life? Well, he says this in the book. If change and growth are not programmed into your spirituality, did you get that? If change and growth are not programmed in your spirituality, if change and growth are not programmed into your spirituality, it's not if, it's a must. We are a work in progress, always changing, growing, deepening, and learning more. That when we started out and our world perception was this big and it became this big and this big, it just keeps going and widening. And you find yourself in a greater mystery that isn't so scary. And as soon as we say, don't change, I'm not going to change, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, we have stopped maturing, if we ever did in the first place. Instead, we say no to growing up and discovering the fullness of union with God. And so he continues with that statement. If change and growth are not programmed into your spirituality, if there are not serious warnings about the blinding nature of fear and fanaticism, your religion will always end up worshiping the status quo. Woo! and protecting your present ego position and personal advantage as if it were God. What is he saying? Sometimes we miss the wall. Sometimes churches lean their ladders against the wall of status quo instead of entering the dangerous world of growing up. How many of you remember growing pains growing up? Knees, hips, ankles, head. My ears grew faster than the rest of my body, so I was disproportionate most of my life. My nickname was Dumbo, right? Growing up is a tough thing, and you survive it, right? That's what happens in the spiritual life. We grow up, and we don't just survive it, we thrive through it. In so doing, we become aware of what is already here and all around us. The reality, I think, of what many find is that much of church and much of the debates in churches is all centering around first half living because it's easy. Black, white, good, evil. Inside the circle, outside the circle. And the challenge for us is to be a people as individuals and as a community of faith that open up that circle and say, we're all in this together. Because just as Paul said, it's not that I have attained this yet, but I'm striving to reach the goal, and if he hasn't attained it, what he's saying to the Philippians is, neither have you. And he's saying to us, neither have we. But we keep striving in order to reach that goal of finding ourselves in a fullness of self in the story and in the presence of God. I find it so hopeful. We're a work in progress. And we're learning and we're growing and we're changing. And we're learning that grace isn't just mine or yours, it's all's. That love isn't confined and there isn't a limit of love. Instead, it's everywhere all the time. And that when we begin to learn how to pray without ceasing and see every movement of every day and every experience of every moment as a moment of encounter with God and of learning something new, the world becomes a laboratory, a place in which we can learn all the days of our lives, and it will never end. In fact, in the last service, one of those green parrots was trapped in the sanctuary. Whoosh. And he would turn around and whoosh, all the way back. And I asked the congregation, can you look at the parrot that's sitting above us and see the fingerprints of God in it? And can we go from this place of worship and into the world around us and have eyes to see and ears to hear the movement of the Spirit that's already happening? For these moments of silence, I want you to repeat that phrase. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. And say it a couple more times, and then we'll share in the sacred meal so that we may be nourished by the Spirit to live as God's people today. Would you join me in a moment of silence?